when it comes to aliens, there's some things I just can't tell you on air.
But you'll tell us off air? Great.
You know, no, look. The truth is that when I came into office, I asked, right? I was like, all right, you know, is there the lab somewhere where we're keeping the alien specimens in spaceship? You know, they did a little bit of research, and the answer was no. But what is true, and I'm actually being serious here, is that there's footage and records of objects in the skies that we don't know exactly what they are. We can't explain how they moved, their trajectory. They did not have an easily explainable pattern. And so, you know, I think that people still take seriously trying to investigate and figure out what that is. But I have nothing to report to you today.
It's okay.
Unless, like, that. See, here's the question. Reggie might secretly be an alien.
All right. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Cultish, Entering the Kingdom of the Cults. My name is Jeremiah Roberts, and one of the co-hosts here. I am here on Facebook Live today, live streaming with Andrew, the super sleuth of the show.
Yeah.
What is happening, man? You super excited to be here?
I'm super excited to be here, thinking about monochromatic video footage of pyramids flying in the sky and tic-tac shaped objects shooting off faster than the speed of sound.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. And a crazy time to be. It is just such a crazy time to be alive. It feels like the whole world has gone cultish.
Yeah.
Our set feels normal. This used to be where the cultish place where cultish things happen and what we talk about. But now it's the whole world is cultish central. I mean, ever since COVID and all the craziness going on, and now what used to be kind of in the category of the fringe, in the world of the X-Files, and the weird tinfoil hat world, and the weird Reddit underbelly of conspiracy theories. Now, from every different aspect, whether it's right or left. I mean, you talk about people are talking about it on like Matt Walsh, Tucker Carlson. You know, even former President Barack Obama. We just played a clip of him, one of the most recent with James Corden, his late show. He was being asked about what aliens are. In fact, just recent, I believe on Good Morning America, former President Bill Clinton was being asked about it. And so you have everyone from all different sides, left or right. And what I'm excited about is that since Cultish started, we have been kind of beating the drum in regards to the fact that this is an important conversation to have, and we can't ignore it, especially if you want to be able to give a definitive, level-headed apologetic that makes sense to the world that's going to be asking questions. And now here it is all over the news. So rather than to try and, you know, toot our own horn or gloat or say, I told you so, what we want to do is just kind of have a fun conversation. Again, if you are joining us here on Facebook Live, definitely we look forward to interacting with you all. And also we will be taking your questions. So just hold off towards the end. And when we do the Q&A, we'll try and interact with as many questions as you can. So what we have going on today, we are streaming live. We have two of our former guests who have been very involved. They work with us behind the scenes, just talk in regards to any of our other episodes on UFOs. So with us, we have former guest Colin Samul, and we also have Dr. Ray Boeche. It's great for you all to join us today.
Glad to be here.
Good to be here.
Awesome. Excellent. And so just for anyone who's on this live stream for the full time, perhaps they haven't listened to our previous episodes, Colin, can you just tell them just really briefly about who you are, what got you into UFOs, and why do you think this conversation is important?
Sure. So I am a Presbyterian minister, ordained in the RPCNA, currently pastor and church planner of Great Basin Reformed Presbyterian Church in Reno, Nevada. It's Nevada, not Nevada, just to make that clear. I've been following this subject since before I was a Christian. As I said in our previous podcast, sort of my mentality growing up was that if there was anything weird or out of the ordinary that was real, it was the UFO subject. I was raised in the 90s with sightings and the X-Files, and so that all that stuff was in my head. And towards the end of high school, got into the New Age, and those two worlds intersect that I quickly discovered, although I didn't know that watching, all of these shows on TV growing up. It seemed like a very nuts and bolts thing. And left the New Age after about 2 years. And then a year after that, God delivered me from that, and I was brought to the gospel. Spent 2 years as a Baptist, and then moved on to the right view of Presbyterianism. And I just, got to have that jab there.
Yes.
And I'm just messing. Love you guys.
Of course.
Then went to seminary. That was about a 5-6 year process. And then soon after I left seminary and was interning and all of that, that's when all of this Tom DeLonge stuff started. And I always kind of kept an eye on people like Stephen Greer and all of that. And once I saw what was happening with Tom, I said, something's actually happening here that might actually be this disclosure that everybody's been longing for since it was all covered up in the 50s and 60s. And lo and behold, here we are. It's happening. So I started following it. I reached out to you guys a couple years ago, introduced the subject and sort of what I had seen, and it has progressed. And as you said, we don't want to gloat. We don't want to say told you so, but told you so.
Yeah.
And I think we are still at the beginning of this. So this just brings up worldview questions. I mean, think about how much COVID messed with the church. How do you think something like this is going to mess with people's views? The average person in the pew, I don't know what's real anymore. I thought we were all supposed to laugh at that. How does this fit in with the Bible? And then there's larger issues that we'll get into associated with the subject that should be of pastoral concern. So that becoming mainstream is something we need to pay attention to. But I think it could also be a healthy thing for the church, because we have acquiesced to an anti-supernaturalistic view, even though we say on paper we believe in the supernatural. So we're going to be forced to reckon with things that our forefathers in the ancient church, the medieval church, were fine. Not that they were okay with the powers of darkness, but they recognize this is reality. And we're going to have to recognize this is reality. So that's my introduction and an overview of my involvement with this subject.
Yes, definitely. And I could not agree with you more, Colin. In fact, you're talking about how COVID just sort of messed with people. I was just thinking about visually, two images that come to mind from March 2020 was just seeing both the Las Vegas Strip, where you are from, Nevada, completely empty and vacant, and then also seeing Times Square completely empty at the same time. And just my mindset was just, what is going on? What is happening? And so absolutely, in many ways, it's going to be the same thing, especially as this progresses. We're definitely going to delve into that. So, Ray, I appreciate you coming on, and it's a blast to have you on again and be able to chat with you. Just tell everyone just briefly just about who you are, and what is your interest in the whole UFO discussion. What has been your involvement over the last, and how long have you been involved in it?
Longer than you guys have been alive, I think. I'm getting along in the tooth here. I became interested in this when I was 10 years old. That was in 1965. The whole subject of UFOs, flying saucers. Became intrigued with it when my family had a sighting on our back porch, and began to follow it very avidly and began to do research. I was involved very heavily for the next 8 years. And then, much like Colin, I branched out, because you get involved in one aspect of this, and it's interesting theologically and philosophically how it leads you into this web of occultism. And I became heavily involved in that, and received Christ as my Savior in my April of my senior year in high school. Backed away from it for quite a while. Got interested again as a working adult. There was an interesting case. We were living in Omaha. I was teaching for the public schools. A pet goat had been mutilated in broad daylight in an urban neighborhood in Omaha. And there was a piece in the paper about it. And I started tracking that down. That sort of brought all the experiences I've had with cattle mutilations and those sorts of things back. And I began to delve into it from a different perspective. I came to realize in the 80s, particularly, that this web of occultic involvement entraps everyone who gets involved, or almost everyone who gets involved. It's easy to fall into that. And I realized no one is giving a Christian response to this. No one is speaking to this from a Christian worldview. And it raises, these things raise fundamental questions. You go back to my favorite way to categorize it: origins, meaning, morality, destiny. Mm-hmm. Where do we come from? Why are we here? How should we live? Where are we going? And so I began work on a master's degree in apologetics and systematic theology. And because I knew that I wanted to approach my speaking engagements at conferences and those sorts of things from a Christian viewpoint. I had the credibility of a researcher to back it up. So I was able to be heard by the people in the let's just say paranormal community in general. They knew I knew what I was talking about, and so they were willing to listen. So that opened a lot of doors to tell people about Christ and how the world really works from a Christological viewpoint. 1994, I was ordained then as a Baptist pastor. Then in 1994, I was asked by the Reformed Episcopal Church to consider planting a church here in Lincoln, and was ordained then as a priest in the Reformed Episcopal Church, and had a church for 10 years, had some health issues, heart attack and a bout of cancer, and had to retire, give that up. All this time I was working as a graphic designer, the book designer, mm-hmm. and still speaking, and again, branching out into the apologetic outreach in this. In 2011, I retired from the University of Nebraska Press, where I'd been for almost 20 years, and went into ministry full time, transferred my credentials to the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and served as one of the pastors at the second largest LCMS congregation in the country here in Lincoln. And I was a pastor for adult education. So that gave me a lot of great opportunities to wake the church up from within as to the reality of these things and how we should look at them and the kind of responses we should be able to make as Christians. Yeah. That's pretty much it. I finally retired. Again, I'm dealing with a second round of cancer, different kind of cancer now. Mm-hmm. But I retired about a year ago. I quit working for pay. Let's put it that way. And so now I'm able to spend all of my time working on research, writing papers, and being free to be able to do things like this. To help encourage, we're told as a pastor, we're told our job is to equip the saints for ministry. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think programs like Cultish do. We're here to equip the saints to go out and minister to those within their sphere of influence.
That's good. I have a question for you, Ray and Colin. You can probably piggyback off it. But in terms of thinking about UFOs or UAPs, we have a modern paradigm through which we interpret the events that are going on around us. And there's specifically there's a secular paradigm that I would argue that has infiltrated, the mainstream church, right? So when these things start happening, people get questions, their faith is challenged because they're not actually looking through UFOs, UAPs through a true Christian perspective, but they have a modern secular paradigm in terms of a materialistic, extraterrestrial beings in origin. But can you guys dig into the origins of this modern paradigm? Where did it come about from, on typically how people view or have viewed this UFO phenomenon, and how is that paradigm being challenged now by the information that's coming out? Yeah,
because there's an underlying history that spans 50 years up until now. So the question is, in the same way we did the road to Jonestown, here we are in 2021. Well, there's a whole history going back in the 1950s and even earlier. You think about the documentary The Phenomenon, where it talks about the whole history. I know, Colin, Ray, you have both watched that. But yeah, maybe before we kind of get into modern events, maybe we can kind of turn back the clock a little bit. Let's maybe talk about some significant events that got us to where we are today. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think I guess I would toss this in there as a good place to start. The problem that we experience today with this idea of materialism, naturalism, anti-supernaturalism really goes back to the Enlightenment. That's the origins of it. And one of the people who was a huge influence on me was a man, writer named Charles Fort. And Charles Fort had a quotation. He said, "Science is a turtle that says its own shell encloses all things." Science is a turtle that says its own shell encloses all things. That's the materialist viewpoint right there. There is nothing outside of our little bubble of reality that we recognize as reality. And so when something anomalous comes along, the materialist has no place to put it. The only possible explanation they can go to is another materialist explanation. So there are strange lights in the sky, there are strange entities that are seen. Well, they can't be supernatural, so therefore they must be extraterrestrial. They must be a life form that evolved on a different solar system in a different galaxy and has made its way to us. So they oversimplify it by cutting the entire spiritual aspect of existence out. They just exclude that whole cloth. And so you're really hampered by that. You've limited your toolbox to one crescent wrench. That's all you've got left, and that's materialism. And so if you need to operate in a different way, you're not equipped to do that.
That's really good. And what thoughts do you have on that, Colin?
Yeah, I think what Ray is referring to is also what Francis Schaeffer called the line of despair. And he tied that line of despair to various influences. He rooted it in Aquinas. People debate whether or not he accurately understood Aquinas, but definitely with Descartes and then with Immanuel Kant, with the noumenal phenomenal distinction of our ontology, what is real, and our epistemology, how do we know what we know? And Kant said that the things that were in the noumena are matters of faith or intuition, whereas that which is phenomenal is related to experience. And so he said that God and supernatural entities are in the noumenal realm. They're simply matters of faith. In other words, creedal statements that some people hold onto. And as some modern apologists have articulated it, basically the social bribe is, if you want to believe in those fairy tales, feel free, but it belongs not in reality as we experience it, but the realm of faith. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we cannot comprehend God. So God, in that sense, cannot be directly part of our experience. We know him only by analogy and by his revelation, and his revelation is analogical, as Van Til and others said. But what we've done is we've grouped entities like angels and demons into that distinction and place them in the realm of faith. We believe that they're there because that's what we're supposed to believe. But in our day-to-day life, we agree with Rudolf Bultmann that those who use light bulbs and electricity cannot take angels and demons seriously. And so that's our compromise as the church. I think Ray talked about the overall view of scientism, which is really a working out of that distinction from Kant to its logical conclusion. But the church has acquiesced to that because our compromise is, okay, we'll believe in these things as dogma, but the most we'll believe about angels and demons is maybe I can be tempted to sin. But then when you have a phenomenon that interacts with our military, shuts down nuclear missiles, as I listened to an interview earlier from the Washington Post with Lou Elizondo, and they're just openly talking about this now, that really threatens everything that we've built our modern world around, because it says that man's not the measure of all things. There's other things out there. And as Ray said, the first thing we want to do is preserve our materialism in accounting for it. So that's what the world does. And then the church wonders, well, angels and demons are just involved with temptation. They don't appear physically. They don't do things in history because, again, they're part of the noumena, not the phenomena. And so we don't know where to put it. So I think it not only challenges the modern secular worldview, but it exposes how much we have acquiesced to it in our thinking. Because when we hear about these things, we don't know where to put it. Whereas we can get into this later, our forefathers in the faith would have heard about these types of encounters and known exactly where to put it. So that question that you asked, Andrew, I think is important, and that's the foundation. But then I think you asked, Jeremiah, how do we get where we're at right now with, I'm guessing, disclosure was your question?
Yeah, this could be a whole 10-part podcast, obviously. I mean, there's aspects of, you think about the whole history of the origination of, some of the space programs, and you think about, people involved like Jack Parsons. We talked about him briefly in our episode, Navigating UFOs in the World of the Occult, with Ray. And, there's that unique history, and, there's things like Project Blue Book and that whole history behind that. And you have also, different divisions that try to weaponize the paranormal. So you kind of have, along with, there's sort of this weird timeline of both this interest in different aspects of the paranormal and the occult, and also with evolving technology and space exploration programs and that whole underlying history. But maybe just kind of give some examples, especially with the most recent disclosures, ones that Jeremy Corbell recently dropped that we'll be discussing. Like, what would be some examples in that whole history that you think are kind of unique points of reference, given where we are right now with the current conversation surrounding disclosures?
Well, I think if you go back to 1947, Nathan Twining produced a document in which he says very bluntly, he was an Air Force general, that these things are real and not fictitious or fantasies. These are real things that are being seen. Well, that's exactly where we're at now. It's been 75 years, and now once again, the government is reiterating, hey, these are real. We don't know for sure what they are. In between there, you have a number of significant events. And I would say maybe the most significant involve the shutting down of nuclear missiles in launch silos that happened in the 60s and 70s. Happened at a number of SAC bases across the country. Robert Hastings wrote an excellent book called UFOs and Nukes, where he goes into great detail and provides all of the documentation he obtained through the Freedom of Information Act on these events that took place at nuclear missile installations. So you have something that's threatening aircraft. In 1952, two nights in a row, the White House was buzzed by unidentified flying objects. Fighters were scrambled because it's restricted airspace. No one's supposed to be there. As soon as the fighters got there and got close, they took off. instantaneously disappeared. Then you've got, again, the incursions into nuclear missile installations, nuclear weapons storage areas, numbers of those. And then now we're seeing a nuclear battle force of the Navy followed and swarmed by a herd of these things in the sky that they can't identify. They can see them on radar. They can track them at phenomenal speeds. They can't explain them. There's no propulsion, no control surfaces on them, and yet they're real. And so we're to the point now where the government really needs to, if they can, fish or cut bait, because you've said these things are real. You don't know what they are. Tell us what you do know about them.
Yeah, I'll maybe add in some details there too, just the big picture, and then how I think we got to this point where it has been nightly. Every major news network is interviewing somebody anytime they get an official on, whether it's Leon Panetta, John Ratcliffe the other day, Trump's DNI talked about it. And he, by the way, said, no, this is not Russia and China. They didn't leapfrog us this far. They couldn't have. So how do we get to this point? Well, as one researcher, Grant Cameron, says, and he's very new age. So, I mean, for information, I think he knows his stuff, but obviously I disagree with a lot of his conclusions. That the government for 70 years hasn't disclosed, but it also hasn't covered up. It's done something else. And there does appear to be not only all these series of events, but you can track a history of people on the inside leaking things publicly. Through the 80s and 90s, Ray was contacted by men from the DIA. In the 90s, talk show hosts like Linda Moulton Howe and others have always claimed to have people giving them information. There's been figures like Richard Doty, who's a very interesting character, who openly worked for Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and he shows up at UFO conferences and has been a sort of a contact point, but people have trouble trusting him as he has been involved with disinformation. So we've seen this over the years where they've kept the conversation going as a subculture, pop culture thing. Even the guy who produced Dark Skies, I think his name is Bruce Zeibel. Maybe I'm thinking of a different guy. He has said NBC's Dark Skies, he's big into disclosure now. He said when they were producing that, I think in the 90s, I believe uniformed men from the Office of Naval Intelligence were meeting with him and passing stories along to him to put in the series.
Wow.
So this is so first off, is this a psyop to distract from how bad Biden is a president? They must have time travel too, and Biden's presidency must end really badly. If this has been going on this long, just for that. But what has really happened since 2015 with Tom DeLonge, the guy James Fox with the Phenomenon documentary, as I've heard it described, and as Grant Cameron describes it, there's different teams who've kind of, in a sense, recruited is probably not the best word, but they have access to information from people on the inside, like Jeremy Corbell. And so there's stovepipes in the government that I don't know the motives. We can speculate on it. They want this information coming out. And so they've got two things to contend against. That is the public perception, and then other elements of the government that don't want it out, and possibly our foreign adversaries. So there's been a strategy here in how they have used men like Tom DeLonge and others as sort of like PR people to get conversations going credibly in the media.
Right.
That began in 2017 with the videos being released. So now we can talk about this because this respected publication, and they just introduced it. All it is, we don't know what it is. And then the first thing to make it more acceptable, it could be Russia and China. So for about 3 years, we've hung out in that space where every 3 to 6 months there's been a leak, maybe some media stories, mainstream ones, but it dies out. What happened in March is, or in May, is that 60 Minutes did a very well put together segment on all of this. And in it, they had confirmation from Harry Reid and others that these things go 13,000 miles an hour, stop, make a right angle turn. That's not hypersonic weapons we're trying to develop. The SR-71 that goes 3,000 miles an hour takes half of the state of Ohio to make a right-hand turn. So there was credible people brought out on 60 Minutes, and the information that was presented was more than just weird things that we don't know what it is. They gave details, as did Marco Rubio and others who were on that. And that almost reignited the conversation from the original buzz from the 2017 article. And 60 Minutes is like the New York Times of media journals. It's highly respected. And so since then, it's been daily, weekly, where Tucker Carlson, Andrew Cuomo, Anderson Cooper, even daytime shows, the Today Show, morning shows are talking about this. And then every week there's another official coming out and dropping bombs, like John Ratcliffe on Sunday. We determine these things aren't Russia or China. Don't know what the report will say, but that's what we've determined. The head of NASA this week said he immediately, when he came in, instructed NASA to study this.
Right.
So what's happening is there's such a buzz that those people on the inside have leaked it to the outside, and then it's percolated up. And so now any other stovepipe in the government that decides to continue to cover up and obfuscate is going to have a credibility issue because of how many credible people are now saying otherwise. If they try and put out information that sort of dodges this. And so I would say we're at the point where the cat is out of the bag.
Yeah.
And Pandora's box is open. One last thing I will mention that I think is very significant is Sam Harris, the atheist debunker Sam Harris, on a podcast with Ricky, is it Jarvis, the guy who called out Hollywood?
Ricky Gervais, yeah.
Yeah, on his podcast, he said, look, I've been contacted by people from the CIA, former heads of the CIA, people in the defense establishment and other bona fides, and I'm going to be on Zoom calls because they want my advice on how to message this to the public without causing panic. And he said, we're going to have to apologize to all these people we've made fun of for years about alien abductions. So Sam Harris, the materialist, atheist, skeptic, is now convinced, and he's been tapped as a consultant by people on the inside to help message this to the public in a way that doesn't cause them to freak out. And I heard years ago that part of this was going to be influencers in our culture getting that tap on the shoulder. We need your help. And there, Sam just said that that's what happened to him. So this is going down. I don't know what the timeline is, but we're here, and it's really accelerating.
Yeah, and in fact, that's fascinating because you think about Colin when we were first talking and about Tom DeLonge's whole story about how he reached out to the different government agencies and was talking about, hey, well, maybe I want to actually help you, help communicate to the culture at large. I know what's going on. I know what's on the inside. I want to figure out a way to help you disclose this, which you're having trouble with, because people as a whole, we don't trust the government. I mean, everyone always jokes about, the whole 15 days to flatten the curve, and just in some ways the government has mismanaged COVID. So there is a general distrust, and I think, but it is interesting that now, maybe Tom DeLonge has been a catalyst where now all of a sudden the government wants to reach out and even have influencers like Sam Harris sort of reach out to the public, and maybe they're even prejudiced in the fact of picking him because of the fact that he's a naturalist. So maybe he can help explain it in a level-headed way, but I think he's still going to fall short. One thing that I can let you jump in as well too, I was going to comment just in regards to prejudice that people may have right now. Well, why are they bringing this out under a new administration? This is something that the Biden administration is now conspiring to do, a sort of wag the dog sort of situation. Is that I think one of the things I really appreciated, which I think if anyone listens into is very helpful, is Edward Snowden, when I think in one of his last interviews on the Joe Rogan Experience, he talked about the difference between what the deep state really is, and he just simplified it. The deep state really in many ways is just long-term career politicians who are in Washington for 40 to 50 years, for example. And what'll happen is that you'll have a new administration that'll come in. They've just won an election. They have the first 100 days, and as soon as they get in office, they want to go and get reelected. And usually what happens is that the deep state, people who are these officials who just are long-term career politicians will say, well, we want you, here's what's going on. We want you to do this, this, and this. We'll scratch your back so we can work on getting you reelected. And so there's always that going back and forth. So my point in saying that is that this whole aspect of disclosure is not something that's really rooted in the most recent administration. This is something that goes back to the 1950s. And it's almost, in a political sense, people always view a current conversation regarding politics, whether it's the border crisis or something to do with economics. Like they all focus on the current president, when in reality, this is a byproduct of decisions that have taken place with multiple administrations for decades. So I think people need to understand, don't think of this just through the lens of pro-Trump. Don't put this through the lens of just pro-Biden, but just we need to zoom out and just kind of look at the big picture as far as the entirety of where the U.S. government has been, what they're doing now, then ultimately how we should look at this given a Christian worldview. Andrew, what thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of, disclosures coming specifically from the government, we know there is no such thing as neutrality. So there's always a worldview that's going to have some form of implication on the facts that are being presented. So our duty as Christians, when we're hearing anything, even coming from the government, we should have a healthy distrust, right? We should be able to separate the footage that we're looking at from the worldview being implicated behind the footage. And we need to do that through a Christian worldview. That's just one thing I was thinking. But I do have a question for you guys. And maybe the listeners were thinking this too, but in terms of hearing the word nuclear, right? That these, whatever these things are attracted to nuclear energy, right? My brain all of a sudden started thinking of like Gene Roddenberry in Star Trek and the Prime Directive, like these these civilizations are starting to get this nuclear technology, so it's time to come usher them into this new galactic federation. I don't believe that whatsoever. But in terms of nuclear, why is there this connection between this paranormal situation and nuclear energy, in a sense?
I can only speculate on that, but I'll give you what my feeble mind has come up with to explain that. I think anytime we detonate a nuclear weapon, we're having an effect on the actual fabric of space-time because of this tremendous release of energy. And I think and again, this is a big if these entities are physical in the same way that we are, they might be interested in protecting the fabric of space-time as a whole, the whole space-time continuum, and saying, no, you guys shouldn't mess around with this because you don't understand the implications. You do this, but you've also done this, and this, and you're completely unaware of it. That's the materialist explanation. I have a different theological take on that, but I think that, well, let me expose the elephant in the room here. If these things are spiritual entities, if they're demonic, what better way to alter the way humans perceive them by having them appear to focus on something that would imply that these are physical beings from somewhere else. That this explanation of ripping a hole in the space-time continuum is the greatest harm that could ever be done. And so therefore, these must be physical beings from another planet.
Mm.
If they're spiritual beings, many of whom wish us ill, what better way to disguise it?
Yeah, I mean, that's good.
No, that definitely makes sense. And so one of the things that's always interesting too is just even some of the most recent disclosures that have really brought into the forefront of these conversations. And so one of the most recent ones, I mean, we had the Tic Tac encounter that took place with Charlie Underwood. He was a Navy pilot. I think that was back in 2004? Was that, Colin, what was it?
I think that's right.
Okay. So there was that one, but then there was the most recent one of what appeared to be over the ocean that Jeremy Corbell released. And that appeared to be an oval-shaped flying object that was, I believe it was a infrared camera that was on a fighter pilot. And then you saw it hover around, then it lowered into the ocean. That was one of the most recent sightings. So Colin, could you maybe just talk about that real quickly? And also, let's bring up too just one of the objections that people have, and rightfully so. I think we should look at this stuff with skepticism. We should never take anything at face value. And just from a Christian perspective, I mean, the book of Proverbs says it's the glory of kings to investigate and search out a matter. So we need to think critically. God gave us our mind. We need to look at this and deal with it holistically. But let's also just talk about the objection that people would have, because so many of these sightings, the camera is blurry. People would think, since we're in 4K, since we have 4K cameras, or even like Neil deGrasse Tyson, who was recently on Joe Rogan, he was saying, well, everyone walks around with one of these. You know, they should be able, if these are always in the sky, we should be able to people should be filming this all the time. And again, he's looking at it through a view of naturalism. But yeah, so talk a little bit about that sighting, and also maybe bring up any objections that people would have in regards to blurry UFO footage, and how do we give a level-headed answer towards that?
Right. So I'll actually reverse the order of those questions. I'll first address the camera issue.
Sure.
So with the camera issue, I would say it's actually not as easy as you think to take a very good photo. If you've been married or a family member has been married, what do? Do you just allow your uncle to take all the pictures? No, you hire a professional photographer who's got the right equipment and knows with lighting and angles how to take good pictures. You need both the equipment and the expertise to get really clear photos. And by definition, because of what UAPs are, rarely is it ever going to happen with someone who's set up to take a good picture of it. When it comes to our smartphones, yeah, we all have cameras, but I use this anecdote on another podcast. When Trump flew to Reno on Air Force One, I was like, wow, look at Air Force One. I was on a roof doing some window cleaning. And so I took a picture on my phone, and then I looked at it, and it's fuzzy. You can kind of see the little blue streak that it's Air Force One. Didn't look at all like it did when I took the picture. Those cameras aren't as good as they appear to be. So if something is, thousands of feet out, a mile out, and then especially if it's moving at high speeds, if you even think and manage to take a photo before it's gone, it's not going to be that great. When it comes to what's been released by the government, we have to understand that that's forward-looking infrared. And so that is a camera that tracks heat signatures. It's meant for targeting, because so many of our weapons track something with propulsion. That's what's strange about these objects, is they don't have any heat, though they're moving very quick, or a trail of heat behind them. And so those cameras are not meant to take clear pictures. They're meant to target objects. And they're relatively conventional, so or at least well known, so the government isn't concerned about releasing them because it won't show our capabilities to our adversaries. Chris Mellon, who's highly credible. He's the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence. He's been one of these big guys in the media pushing this. Him and Lou have said there are clearer photos. Most likely they will be released at some point, along with more impressive videos. He said everything that's been released is down here and how dramatic it is. And that goes along with this whole idea of slowly acclimatizing the public and not freaking them out, allowing them to have those objections so they can process it. So that's the camera issue. When it comes to those actual events, so 2004 was more than just the Tic Tac that Commander Fravor chased. Right, they found it above the ocean with frothing water underneath it. And then he went to circle down, and then it looked up and then started mirroring him. And then once he got up close to it, boom, it shot off. And then they had their next cat point, which is, those are the coordinates. I think the computer designates the coordinates and it's all encrypted. But a split second before they received their cat points, the radar operator said, "You'd never believe it, but that thing is waiting for you at your next cat point." And then they got there and it was gone. And then later other jets were sent up and they filmed that famous film we've all seen of the Tic Tac there, and then it shoots off. So that was one event series, and some have happened on the East Coast. The one with the Navy, they came up out of the ocean and we're following them for a longer amount of time than any known drone can stay airborne. Go back into the water, they found no wreckage. That video has just been released of it going down into the water by Jeremy Corbell. And
it might be worth mentioning the testimony that's come out from some sailors on submarines who've mentioned tracking these things at thousands of miles an hour underwater. That's phenomenal in and of itself. How can something travel that quickly underwater? But again, it's evidently the same principle that allows them to fly at hypersonic speeds and not disturb the air and create a shock wave so that you get a sonic boom. There's something weird about that.
There is, and I think what people run into when we say this stuff is we anthropomorphize these things. First, we didn't see it directly, so we picture all the things we've seen in science fiction, and so we think of a very nuts and bolts material object. And they encountered something real. It did interact with the radar. They tracked it on radar, tracked it on sonar, underwater, as Ray just said. But we make assumptions about what that means. And again, our modern worldview is that man's the measure of all things. Miraculous feats are done by men like us creating technology. So if there's something doing miraculous feats in the sky that exhibits intelligence, our first assumption, according to our presuppositions, is this is technology. And that's the language that we were going to describe it in, even if someone doesn't think it's technology. Like Lou Elizondo will say technology, but in some interviews he says, we don't know that it's technology like we think. Even on the interview at the Washington Post today, he alluded to the idea of interdimensional, which was huge. I don't think I've ever heard him say that.
Really?
Yep. And one thing he said on a podcast is, okay, so we hear about it showing up at the cat point before they even knew what the cat point was. So what kind of technology is this that can, read their minds or hack into the system and see where they're at? Well, Lou has said one thing that they speculated in ATIP in studying this is maybe these things have a different relationship to time and space as we do. And so our moment is very quick. We experience time. Everything I just said is echoing in your mind as you're comprehending it. That's the past. Our experience of the present is very short. So he compares it to like a cherry on a cigarette burning. And he said, what if these things are more like a cherry on a cigar, that their experience of time is larger than ours, and what we see is it going in and out, in the sense that it intersected with our timeline at different points. And that's interesting because some church fathers do talk about what's called angelic time. The idea that the angels have a freer relationship to time and space as we do. So I think people hear these military encounters and they just assume it has to be technological, but from all the people who've researched this, from Vallee to Tom DeLonge to his team that he originally set up, Lou and others, and some of the things that they will say more off the record, that's not necessarily so. And even these stovepipes in the government have asked these questions and really said, okay, well, what if it's an artifact of it coming in from another dimension or having a different relationship of time and space than us? And so that's all very interesting. So that intersects with those events and how do you think about it?
Yeah.
And I think there's a spectrum. Some of this might be technological from another country. I think most of it isn't. But we can flesh that out further. But just with those events and the camera issue, yeah, that's how I would sum up that and things we need to be looking at from a Christian perspective in relation to it.
No, definitely. In fact, when you're mentioning about the different interdimensional timelines, immediately I just started thinking this sounds like an outline of a new Christopher Nolan movie. It's like Interstellar Part 2 or something like that. But no, but in seriousness, I mean, it does make sense. Even Ray, you're talking about how some of these objects are flying through water and they're moving at a trajectory you think would create a sonic boom if it was an SR-71 Blackbird or an F-16 fighter plane or something of that nature. I remember just being a young boy and going to Air Force shows and watching and seeing and experiencing that, how loud it is. I mean, to experience a sonic boom is incredible. But the science behind that, you're talking about presuppositions, you're presupposing this object is something that's completely physical and tangible and operating in the real world according to real scientific laws that it's binding by. But then again, the question is if this is something that is different, that is interdimensional, it operates outside of what we can't fully understand or comprehend through a strictly naturalistic scientific mindset. I definitely agree with that for sure. Andrew, did you have any thoughts on that?
No, yeah, that's one of the reasons why I was asking about the paradigm that's being challenged with the modern secular worldview as being materialists, and many Christians being functional materialists as well, and not we're not supposed to be dualists in a sense as Christians. We believe in the supernatural. We also believe in the material, right? We are spirit and body. For example, like with biblical precedent, we can speak to, the stoning of Stephen. When Stephen was being stoned, he looked up and he saw Jesus there standing, right? Like he was there. There's just a veil between it. It's not this distinction of this dualist reality in a sense. It's just something that we don't fully and are fully capable to be aware of in this present state that we occupy. So what I find extremely interesting, especially when we hear about governmental disclosures coming out, the first thing that goes in my mind is that the government's telling us, and they're open-handed right now because of all this information coming out. They're not saying it specifically, but what they're saying is we don't know what this is. We can't make sense of it, right? So I would say filter out all of the noise that you're hearing when you hear about these disclosures, when they're coming from governmental organizations or news organizations, regardless of what they assume. The truth is they really cannot explain it, especially if we get better images of these things. Let's call them things, for example. If there's nothing that can explain how these things can move from A to B, which is like extreme speeds that is impossible to physics, breakneck speeds to where your body would literally, like, just all of your bones in your body would break. If they have no logical explanation through their filter that they're viewing these things through. So I think that's extremely important. But I heard a name there, and I believe before we started this live, that was it Vallee was the name, guys? Ray and Colin?
Yeah. Do you want to, Ray, maybe explain who Jacques Vallee is, and then some of his corpus and his conclusions of
Sure.
Yeah.
It's tough to do justice to it. Here's another 10-part podcast for Vallee's ideas. He's a French scientist. He's an astronomer and a computer scientist. He worked for several years at Northwestern University in the astronomy department there, and at UT Austin. He works in Silicon Valley now, is a venture capitalist more than anything, but has been involved in seminal work in UFO research since the late 60s. His first book was Anatomy of a Phenomenon about UFOs. And he began to abandon fairly early on the idea that these things are physical interplanetary craft. At one point, he's made the statement that if UFOs turn out to be nothing more than extraterrestrial craft, I will be sorely disappointed. He understands that there's a lot more to this. His first venture into this area is called Passport to Magonia. Magonia is the land indwelt by fairies, a supernatural realm that exists alongside of us. And in that, he began to explore the idea of these things coming from other dimensions and jumping into our space-time from their own. He is, by his own admission, his biggest goal is to establish patterns in data. He likes to take an overview and see what he can develop from all of the reports that are out there. He was tasked while he was at Northwestern University to put the entire Project Blue Book files into a database. And remember, this is when everything was still Fortran and COBOL and punch cards. There were no laptops. There's nothing like that. So he managed to do that. So he looks for patterns in data, and then from that tries to extrapolate meaning from that. He is also extremely interested in the possibility of the physical nature of these things, because there are a number of instances in which pieces of alleged craft have been found. One instance in which during 1952, the incursions over the White House, it's alleged that a chunk was shot off of one of these craft by an American jet, and that piece was recovered. And so he's interested in doing atomic level examination of these substances, see if there are anything strange in terms of the isotopic ratios, the compositions, that sort of thing. So far, he hasn't found anything other than there are some things that seem to be only able to be constructed at a molecular level, far more finely tuned than anything we can do with melting alloys together, for instance. But that's not conclusive. The maybe more intriguing thing is, he said, what if these things are not composed of any sort of exotic substance? What if it's standard earthly material? That raises a whole other set of questions, because then if these things are composed of material that is just like we could possibly produce here, how are they doing things that it's impossible for things within our physical universe to do? So you open a whole different conundrum. So Jacques Vallee is the
man.
He's the dean of the intellectual school of thought on UFOs.
Yeah, and he's put an extensive amount of work, and I had to jump out just to take care of something. I'm back on here. If it wasn't mentioned, just jumping back in here, is that you're talking about the aspect of the physical, tangible component. I think there's two interesting ends of the spectrum, Colin, because you mentioned about how the Christian church has gotten almost in a sense almost completely reverse Gnostic and ignoring the spiritual components of the UFO discussion. But then there's others, and we'll address this later on, who strictly only deal with the spiritual aspect. Well, UFOs are just demons, or how somehow the Nephilim is just a one-size-fits-all. It's a one-size-fits-all for anything that's remotely supernatural. That has to be Nephilim. But in regards to like making sense of it, I think it's something we need to be able to level-headedly make sense of both sides. And so in regards to the physical component, the thing that came to mind was the whole story that we jumped into ourselves and that Jeremy Corbell explored in his documentary, Bob Lazar, UFOs in Area 51, because I believe that Bob Lazar at least 100% believes what he believes.
Right.
No doubt that in S4 he worked on spacecraft. So, and if that is the case where he saw something that was remotely there, and I believe he was working on a potential something that was outside the periodic table of the elements. I can't remember the name of the element, but they talked about it in the documentary.
It's like 115.
Unun Pentium.
Unun Pentium. I've never actually worked with that sort of element myself. I'm interested in what that would look like or what that could actually make. That would be fun to kind of assemble some things together like Play-Doh or something like that. I don't know. But yeah, there is an aspect where there is something that's tangibly physical and tangibly spiritual. Let me ask you this too, and this is something that people have brought up together. Like when it comes to this whole conversation, we're given examples of things going on in the people like Sam Harris, former presidents talking, celebrities talking, it being all over the news. Like I said, both left leaning and right leaning. And again, we played that clip from Barack Obama just because we know a lot at the very beginning of it, because we know a lot of people who listen in are probably more conservative, left-wing leaning. So immediately there's that skepticism going on. But you also have to understand too that if someone is a skeptic, but they hear Tucker Carlson, they're going to have their skepticism too because he's on the right side. Right. So how do we make sense though of navigating between the two? Navigating the physical aspect and the spiritual aspect. Okay. How do we do that?
I'll pick up on that because it kind of relates to something I wanted to follow up with what Ray said. I think Ray gave an excellent overview of what Vallee is saying. Mm-hmm. And Vallee always gets mentioned because everybody respects him no matter what end of the spectrum they come from in this field. That's why I interjected and said he's the man, because I mean that's just how he is viewed. Vallee says these things are coming from another dimension, and yet their physical characteristics appear to be things they formed from matter here, and yet displayed these odd characteristics through them. A big question in the history of the church, especially the medieval church, was how can a spirit manifest physically? Mm-hmm. So how did the angels eat a meal with Abraham, and when they put it in their mouth, it didn't flop out onto the ground?
I've never thought of that before.
But then think of other things too, like Paul says, and I think he was talking about himself, he wasn't sure if he went into the third heaven in his body or out of his body. Elijah gets apparently onto a fiery chariot and physically goes up to heaven, and that's where he is right now, in his physical body. And I do not believe that angels have a fiery stable where they hook up their fiery horses for their fiery chariots in heaven. I think that was simply for the purpose of grabbing Elijah and bringing him to where God wanted him to be. We see angels killing, hundreds of thousands of troops in the Old Testament, not just tempting people, physically killing people on the battlefield. And then, of course, our Lord in his physical body is at the right hand of the Father in heaven. As you said, the spirit matter dualism that from the Cartesian worldview, where it's like water and oil that don't mix, that's not the biblical view, but it's always been a question of, okay, so how does it work? Some church fathers and Reformed church fathers like Zanchius said they are made of subtle matter that can shift in, right, and appear physically if they want to. The majority report from the Western Church is, interestingly enough, that when they form bodies or whatnot, they take what they said was air or some other substance and compress it and form bodies to work through. And does that not exactly sound like this layering that they found in this material from some of these things that have shot off from crafts? In fact, I listened to an old interview with Tom DeLonge before he started his company, when he was just saying he had these contacts, and he said one of his contacts basically said, it's like, he said, how do these things appear from another dimension physically midair and then disappear? And this guy that was his source says it's like nanotech injection molding. They just form it and then they can disperse it. And that sounds strikingly like what Aquinas and Francis Turretin and others said. You know, there's speculations on how angels appear physically within our realm. So it fits like a hand in glove. So number one, there is no duality in the Cartesian sense, but we have resources from the history of the church that they thought through these things. And a lot of it sounds strikingly similar to what people like Vallee have said. Ray, do you have anything to follow up on?
No, I think that's a great summation of it. It really is the early church fathers. I mean, from Origen and Tertullian on, and especially the Reformed divines, they would understand this in a way that we don't, because they didn't have the technology. They didn't have the technological background that we possess, but it would make perfect sense to them. So no, I think he did a brilliant job of summing that up.
Yeah.
So in a sense, these UFOs or UAPs, this is nothing new in a sense as well. We're not just the only generation of humans to experience things like this. There's cultural distinctions between different groups of people who have also experienced similar things, of things flying in the sky where they have no explanation. Is that correct?
Well, here, let me throw back to one of my heroes, John Keel.
Mm-hmm.
John Keel said, "These things have been here from the beginning.
Mm.
There has never been a time that these things have not been present in this world." And I think, and he is one of the, again, one of the most Christian atheists I have ever known, because he has such a great, he's an atheist, but he has a great grasp of the spiritual nature of things. And I think what he's saying there is these things are part of this universe, the paranormal part, that which goes alongside the normal, and they pop in and out, and they've always been here. So yeah, it's not an isolated thing. It's not a recent thing. People have always had these experiences.
Yeah. And I think that discussion will begin to open up. Even with these disclosures, they're making it sound like, well, we don't know what these things are that we're running into all of a sudden. That was the original. And so that kind of made it go with, well, maybe China just leapfrogged us. But even with the data that's out there, intelligence analysts and others have said, okay, well, the Tic Tac was in 2004. No way they leapfrogged us for that long.
Right.
Even though a leapfrog now is impossible. But now you're beginning to see more open discussion from the media that, well, this is the same phenomenon people have been talking about since the 50s. And then I think the discussion will open up to historical examples like the airship sightings in the 1800s. And of course, there's all sorts of things from history, flying shields above battlefields, flying canoes that were reported, strange things in the sky. They always seem to be interested in military movements.
Right.
Interestingly enough. So that's not a new aspect either.
Yeah. What do you think and we've talked about this before in some live streams and some previous podcasts. Because I mean, if you look at the camp that would argue that UFOs are strictly demons, right? And then you would look at in Ephesians where it talks about our battle is not against flesh and blood, but rather the principalities and powers of darkness. So if that indeed is the case, if they're strictly spiritual in nature, what is the reason why they have a thing for showing up at military bases, or if there's this Tic Tac encounter is strictly a demon that somehow the F-16 pilot got lucky and saw him back in 2004-ish? I mean, what's the motive behind it appearing at these military bases or the shutting down nuclear facilities, Ray, like you were talking about? How do we make sense of that?
I would toss this out there. What is Satan's ultimate goal? He wants to deceive humankind.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't want us to come to a saving knowledge of Christ. He wants to confuse us. He's a liar and the father of liars. So if these are all demonic, what better way to deceive a populace than to appear as a technologically superior race who then, as we anthropocentrize things, then says, well, obviously, if they're that much more technologically advanced than we are, they must be much more spiritually advanced. So please, little gray aliens, tell us what you believe about God. And then it opens the door to whatever these entities say. A lot of people are going to buy in and say, oh, that's exactly right. Well, look what they can do and we can't. They must be telling us the truth. Why would they lie to us? And so, that's one aspect of it. I think we have to never close the book on the fact that we can't limit God's creative ability to simply life on this planet. We know that we're created in God's image. We can't say that he didn't create other intelligent life that is not in his image. So these things could be life forms. I doubt it. Knowing the physics of this universe, I doubt it. And the peculiarities and fine tuning that takes place for life to exist here, I doubt that it's life elsewhere, but it could be. And so we can't, if we rule that out a priori, we've just lost a great deal of the population who say, well, they won't even consider this. They've got one thought in mind. They're not examining the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So yeah, I'll follow up with that too. That if you look in the history of the church, there was more openness than you might think to the idea of intelligent life on other planets. It was a debate and a discussion, I believe, in the 1800s. It was in the medieval time. I think they even called it the doctrine of divine abundance or something. The
That's
idea
right.
that God wouldn't create an empty universe. And I think in the medieval times, way before the Reformation, I think there was even a guy who was burned at the stake for denying it. Because, they were quite trigger happy with persecuting anybody who disagreed with the church. But there was a period where that was an open discussion. In the 1800s, Thomas Chalmers, who's a Scottish Presbyterian, in responding to Tom Paine, who said, well, clearly we see all the planets now. Clearly there would be life on them. And so what, did Jesus have to die in each one of those planets? So he used that as his apologetic for deism. And Thomas Chalmers was very adamant that, no, I do believe that that's quite possible, but that life isn't made in God's image, wasn't under the covenant of works like Adam was. So the drama of redemption's here on earth. We are, he said, we are still in a unique position.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't deny that. Now, again, I'm not saying I necessarily agree with that, but there is a lexicon from Orthodox men in the history of the church who have wrestled with this question. Again, as Ray said, I'm not affirming that that's what this is.
Right.
But I think for the sake of argument, at least exposing people to the fact, so much of this, okay, how do we engage with this? Do we have a credible answer? The question of life elsewhere, the church actually wrestled with that before it became a fad in the modern world. So it does show that the church is intellectually engaged. When it comes to the question of demons too, I think you were alluding to something, Andrew, when you quoted the text about principalities and powers. We have to keep in mind too that we don't quite understand everything about the angelic realm, and we have no reason to think that the demons, which is our shorthand for fallen angels, aren't from all different types of orders, whatever the order is. It appears to be that Satan was a seraphim or a cherubim from certain texts. But the mere fact that part of the good news is that Christ has triumphed over the principalities and the powers and authorities shows us that from the different rankings, whatever it is, and there's all these speculative systems in the history of the church, whatever that is, there's fallen and unfallen ones. And I still think, just with the technological meme, when we think of a UFO, of a nuts and bolts thing, still when you say demon, the red pajamas with the pitchfork comes to mind, and young girls spitting up split pea soup, from The Exorcist. That's what we think of with demon, but I believe that the category is broader than we might assume. And their interest in our activities, well, the spirit realm on both sides seems to be very interested in our activities. We learn in the New Testament, the angels long to look into the things that we know as the church. We even see in Daniel, seems to be an interest in a parallel between what's going on in the spirit realm and what's going on in warfare between nation states, with Michael saying he had to fight the Prince of Persia, and that kind of mirrored what was going on geopolitically at the time. Mm-hmm. Even the term watchers, which is used just once in Daniel, implies that these spiritual entities watch us. And that's interesting too, because this phenomenon seems to just do a lot of watching, mm-hmm. and not a whole lot of intervention. Though. Right. So just to kind of challenge us to remain biblical, but to think outside the box, and maybe there's things that we're not seeing, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I want to toss, as looks like we're getting closer on time here. Mm-hmm. I want to toss this out just as an unassailable point of hope for Christians. Go read the 8th chapter of Romans. And if you don't have time to read the entire 8th chapter of Romans, concentrate on verses 38 and 39. For I'm convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Mm-hmm. I know there are going to be Christians who, regardless of how this comes out, who are going to be shaken because of this. What are you worried about? Romans 8, 38, 39. You read that and tell me what you're concerned about.
Mm-hmm. I want to get something, because we are approaching the end, in light of what you just said, Ray. I want this to be on the record, because I do want UFO Twitter. They are all interested in you. This is one thing, Ray, for as much as the UFO people may not like the Christian view of things, everyone I've talked to respects Ray. So Ray, is it the Christian perspective that we should cover up this information and be on the side of a cover-up? Because that's the idea with this Collins elite thing that people often tie you to with the contacts you had in the 90s.
And that to me is the is the rankest, vilest attitude that any Christian could ever take. What are we afraid of? We're here to explore God's creation. Mm-hmm. That's, as Francis Bacon said, God's given us two books, the Holy Scriptures and the Book of Nature. And so we can explore the Book of Nature, and we need to explore every aspect of the physical world, mm-hmm. because all that does is reflect more of God's glory onto him. The more we discover about creation, the greater we glorify him, the more we can understand that. So for a Christian, we should never be afraid to expose everything. Let me temper that. I'm not saying we should expose things that would make us as a nation or any nation vulnerable to their enemies by exposing our information gathering techniques, those sorts of things. But in terms of reality, we should not be afraid to explore and examine and discuss openly everything, because we have nothing to fear.
Absolutely. And in fact, one thing, and just Ray, how much you got a meeting in a not too long from now? How much more time do you have?
I can give you another 20 minutes.
Okay, sounds good. I just want to get, okay, awesome. So this is an important segment, I think, just because now I totally agree. The scripture that came to mind were two things, is that one, this is the world, we should have a perspective of this is the world that Jesus Christ created, that all things were created by him and for him. So if indeed whatever these indeed are, they exist in the world that God created, that Jesus Christ is Lord over. He created all things, both visible and invisible. So it is not something that we should fear. But also, in regards to think about Christ's ministry here on earth, what did he say when he was before trial? He said, everything I've spoken openly. I haven't done anything in secret. So we should not have the fear of having to hide anything. We should bring it out into the open, shine the light of the gospel on it, and have that sort of conversation. And so I think this is important. When a lot of people are asking, well, the so what? Who cares? Why does this matter? Because I want to get your thoughts on this, Colin. I believe that right now we aren't just really in a secular, we're not just becoming secular. We are in free fall right now. We are plummeting. We are going off the cliff. Historically, whenever a society goes off the deep end when it comes to secularism, there's this giant gaping spiritual hole or vacuum, and that usually gets filled in by paganism, occultism, just because we all have that Jesus-shaped hole that we long for, and it ends up being filled up by that vacuum. So the reason why I bring this up is because you always look at ufology has a unique relationship to the world of the occult. Now, there is aspects where it's strictly physical, which we may sometimes, if we do another intelligence briefing, we'll talk about that. That's showing up with an F-16 fighter pilots. I mean, they're not doing an occultic ritual. They're just doing a security detail over a naval base. These objects show up. But there are legitimate practices that God calls an abomination. You do not do. You don't even entertain them. And that is part and parcel to this whole UFO discussion. So do you both want to just give your thoughts on just the relationship of UFOs to the world of the occult, the dangers of it, why we think we are there as a culture, and then how do we address that right now as Christians, given where we are as a culture? Because I truly believe that the reason why this is important, we've been beating this drum here for 2 years, that as these disclosures come up and people don't have an answer for it, ufology typically is a gateway into the world of the occult, which is an immense danger given the secularism. I see tons of people being brought into a lot of real spiritual blindness and deception. So that's one of my heart and motivation even behind having you both on. So I'll just leave it up to you, Ray or Colin. I'll leave it up to you to see who wants to go first. I'll let you both piggyback off each other.
Well, I'll jump in first. There is I think the greatest example of the UFO question leading into the occult is probably Stephen Greer and his CE5 thing. I mean, when you're trying to psychically contact aliens and draw them in, and you have spiritual manifestations take place, you're dealing with something that is far beyond extraterrestrial life. You may be dealing with interdimensional life in terms of coming from the supernatural to the natural. But it's very, very easy to be pulled into a study of UFOs. And unless you have a solid understanding of origins, meaning, morality, and destiny, if you don't have a solid foundation for those 4 questions, then you're going to be open to all sorts of deceptive ideas. And there are countless ideas that will people who purvey them would love to tickle your ears with. And we're right back to scripture. Because there are people that are heaping teachers around them to tickle their ears. So Colin, I'll let you take it from there.
Sure. I think when a culture's paradigm is beginning to break down, you see a pattern in history where people go to the occult looking for answers. And Gary North, in his book Unholy Spirits, that I highly recommend, views this interpretation of history through Van Til's rationalism, irrationalism, critique of man-centered epistemology. That the Christian's the true rationalist because we believe that God is incomprehensible, he is reasonable, but we can't comprehend him. So we have a foundation for believing the world is rational without becoming rationalists, because there isn't an identity, there's an overlap between our thoughts and God's thoughts, hence why we can think his thoughts after him and he can reveal himself to us. But we can't use our own mind, even the laws of logic, as a way to determine truth. It is certainly, truth is not going to be incoherent since God is the foundation of logic. But we are not rationalists. In a sense, as Van Til would say, we're true rationalists as Christians, but we're not rationalists in the worldly sense. And so what happens is a society builds its understanding around man's philosophies, whichever views have risen to ascendancy and seem to work. But because it's just man's views and not the truth, because God is truth, eventually the holes show up. And eventually the paradigm breaks down, and then there's a swing towards irrationalism, looking for answers there. And irrationalism plays in to the occult, secret knowledge, knowledge gained outside of the ordinary paths of gaining knowledge. And as North shows in his book, there's even outbreaks of more occult phenomenon in these periods throughout history. So I do think there's a connection in light of where we are at culturally, though of course the enemy is always at work. Even when throughout history nations were founded on Christianity, there was still witchcraft and all these things that were reported, but they had a worldview to explain it and to resist it. A major question in the ancient world was not only how can I be right with God, but how can I be protected from the evil spirits? And that's why the Christus Victor understanding of the atonement was so emphasized in the early church, because that was the question people were asking. It's not that it's in conflict with penal substitution. It's not that the early church didn't teach penal substitution, but a big question was, how can I be protected from the evil spirits? And so I think as people swing from rationalism to irrationalism, as C.S. Lewis says, as they swing from being materialists to magicians, which this phenomenon seems to be psychologically targeted to do.
What C.S. Lewis book is that?
It's in the intro of the Screwtape Letters.
Man, I need to read that. That is so indicative of where we are, man. That's crazy.
As he says, the enemy would rather have us either be materialists or magicians.
Yes.
So in the time of transition, we can show you can account for the supernatural and remain rational. Hey, Sam Harris, maybe you should start taking us more seriously too now.
Right.
Now that your worldview has fallen apart. Because we can offer you an account that won't get you into all this woo.
Yeah.
And so yeah, that's my approach, that Christianity can speak to this and answer it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you're trying to go ahead.
No. I was just thinking as well too, just in regards to the cultural aspect of just being a magician versus a materialist. And in fact, I was thinking about influencers and people who are having influence in the culture. Demi Lovato. She is someone who is been a huge influence, especially in the younger millennial Gen Z age. And, what's interesting is that in one of her posts, probably about 6 months ago, she was talking about she actually went out to a CE5 disclosure with Dr. Stephen Greer to an actual outing, and she experienced whatever these dimensional demonic entities were doing during this seance. And she equates that to a very unique moment of her spiritual growth as a human being. Very, very open about that. And so, and even now, she's had some statements now about her now gender identity and just the confusion that she has there. But honestly, honestly just hearing that in connection to Stephen Greer just broke my heart, because as much as, sometimes there are some people even making memes kind of joking back and forth towards Demi Lovato, just that my heart hurt, just because this is she's indicative of just really the cultural confusion that we have as a whole, and someone who is trying to find spiritual fulfillment in what Stephen Greer was presenting through these occultic seances. And how is Stephen Greer doing that? He's using the current UFO disclosure as saying all this is happening, but go ahead and you can skip out the middleman. You don't have to worry about the disclosure to happen. You can download this app. As we said before, don't download the app.
Don't do it.
Don't do it. It's spiritually dangerous, but you can go ahead and cross dimensions and get in contact with higher entities to gain this special esoteric knowledge. And this is part of what makes you and defines who you are. And so and then again, not just that, you have different UFO cults. You think about in the late, prior to the year 2000, when everyone thought that the millennium was happening, you had a big variety of cults, whether it is Heaven's Gate. There's a lot of other lesser known cults that had something to do surrounding aliens. So that just, times of uncertainty do create massive movements. And this is why we think this is to have an important discussion about this.
I think you can sum up the whole problem with an old song title: "Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places." I mean,
absolutely.
People are looking for an unconditional love in all the wrong places, because there's only one place that you can truly find that, and that's in Christ. And everything else is a cheap substitute.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting too, as I was listening to one of Tom's earlier podcasts today. This was when he was on Fade to Black.
Yeah, I listened to some of that today.
I'm here to tell you UFOs are bad news. And I believe he went with Stephen Greer and did those exercises in the desert. And on this interview, he said, well, I did something dumb that I shouldn't have done, and opening myself up to these things. And so it's interesting that he's all pro-disclosure, but he's the opposite of Stephen Greer, that he doesn't have a Christian view, but he does see deception and the danger in all of this. So this is a conversation, and isn't just one view. There's people with different views. And, I would like to just ask Tom, have you ever read Deuteronomy? Because you said you weren't supposed to do those things, but there's this really old book that also says you're not supposed to do those things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's just interesting seeing, even, I guess you could call that common grace from Tom, knowing that a lot of this stuff is bad. So it begs for us to enter into the conversation there, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And in fact, one of the things I think Walter Martin talked about when he talked about having a passion for the people who are trapped in the world of the occult, and he says, people are everyone's saying to reach out beyond, but you have told us to draw near to you. Mm. And there is an aspect where people are trying to reach out beyond to try and find spiritual wholeness, fulfillment, and ultimately forgiveness, because all of us know that we've sinned against a holy God, and all of righteousness is like filthy rags. And the only way to truly have peace is not to try and get in contact with interdimensional craft, beings, entities, knowledge, or try and cross a forbidden dimension. The only hope is to cross the only dimension that's possible for peace with God, which is the dimension that was made possible by Jesus Christ, who is fully God, fully man. Because again, when we're having this whole UFO discussion, we're talking about the physical components and the spiritual components. Well, that was met perfectly in the person of Jesus Christ. You have God who is 100% man, and then you have God, and also who is 100% God, who came here, lived the life that we couldn't live, bore a punishment for us on the cross that we could have the righteousness of God and cross that dimension in the right way to have peace and fellowship with him, that Christ said in the high priestly prayer that he wants to be able to share with us if we would repent of our sins and put faith in him. And so the reason why maybe I'm getting a little preachy here is because this is really the true reality of the true answer to this whole discussion. This is the only way that someone like Tom DeLonge, Jeremy Corbell, Demi Lovato, all these people who are reaching out beyond, like there's so much even in Tom DeLonge's, everything he's done with angels and airwaves and all the work that he's done just kind of really shows the image of God imprinted on him. Mm-hmm. Like God has put eternity in the hearts of men. And here they are emulated in so many different ways, but the only way to truly set yourself straight in that regard is to look to the only person who bridged that dimension, which is the God-man, Jesus Christ. So enough of me. Give me any of your thoughts about the importance of why is the gospel important to this as Christians as we wrap up here.
What isn't the gospel important to?
Mm-hmm.
Amen.
Yes. I mean, Ray just hit the nail on the head.
Yes.
I also think of in John 1:51 when you talked about Christ bridging the gap, and in John 1:51, and he said to him, "Most assuredly I say to you, hereafter you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." We all have a longing for something more than the material realm, and that makes sense because we have a soul. And as you said, this is why, or as Ray said, why we look for love in all the wrong places. But we are reconciled to God through Christ. And as Augustine said, our hearts are restless till they rest in you. But even when it comes to this, we all have this desire for, again, that there's more to life than the material. But as we just saw, that's found through coming to Christ, who is the Word made flesh at the right hand of the Father in the highest of heavens. And as the Westminster Larger Catechism says, upon the moment of death, we are translated into the highest of heavens, where we will have a perspective of things that will go beyond anything anybody claims to have with secret knowledge here on earth. And there's a sense in which, as Paul says, we are already seated with Christ in heavenly places. And so as we draw near to God through Christ, we find what we are looking for when we get allured by all these other things. Of course, the other things show us that there is a conflict in this world and in the heavens. It shows us that there is this other dimension of reality, but our anchor is in Christ. And that's where we need to remain rooted through prayer, through being in the Word, through being rooted in a local church, faithful church. And that's as always, that's what we need to be doing. That's what we need to call people to, is to Christ and to be discipled.
No, absolutely. Well, I think this has been a great sort of intelligence briefing of kind of a really broad overview. I feel like within this little over an hour and a half discussion, we probably hit a broad variety of topics that could easily be a 10-part podcast. So let us know this. We mentioned we are kind of in the middle of an overhaul here at Cultish. There's a lot of things that we are in the process of wanting to revamp to make Cultish even better. If this is a discussion you have enjoyed, and if you would like to see more discussions like this, which we think is incredibly important. A lot of you are on here on this Facebook live stream asking really great questions, having some really enlightening conversations. And I think even a lot of the back and forth about, there's some discussion about the difference between I believe an angel or a fallen entity, if I'm not mistaken. And I think the reason even for that passionate discussion, which I saw, is just because there is a vacuum where that the unseen realm really hasn't been discussed. And so, like I said, there's a lot of aspects of Dr. Michael Heiser where I don't agree with him personally. I do appreciate the fact that I think what his work has shown is that there is this huge vacuum of a discussion needs to be had about these subjects, and it's something that we cannot ignore. I would agree fully. Andrew, any last thoughts as we wrap up here?
Yeah, when disclosures are coming out, don't let your uncertainty in the information lead you to question the certainty in God's word. God's word says, sanctify them by the truth. Thy word is truth. God is sovereign. He has declared the end from the beginning. These things are not outside of his sovereign hand or control. He knows about them, knew about them, and it's all for the good, for those who love God, for those who are called according to his purpose, right? This is going to a destination. This is not without purpose. This is not meaningless, but it's only found meaning in purpose rooted in Christ, right? Who is the rock of our salvation, who is, Jeremiah has greatly said, preaching the gospel here, that he is the one who's created everything. There's nothing outside of his control. Like, Christians beyond anyone should have the certainty about the situation that's going on now. Do not let the uncertainty of what's going to happen in the future make you question the certain truth of God's word, because you're only going to get yourself in a predicament where you're going to create idols, where you fear things other than God, which leads you to sin and despair. And the truth is, like Ray said earlier, the answer is in Romans 8. There's nothing that can separate you from Jesus Christ, our Lord, because he is the God-man. Our salvation is secure in him. The enemy is a defeated foe. It's a defeated foe.
Absolutely. All right. So again, if you enjoy this conversation, comment on our latest Facebook live stream. Let us know what you thought, or when this comes out in podcast format, or on YouTube, let us know. Again, Colin and Ray, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
I feel like it's been way too long. I feel like we made for a great power team / fatal four-way, whatever you want to call it.
What?
It's like a wrestling match sort of reference. So,
we need to have a name. We need to have a name for ourselves.
I know.
Man.
We'll have to figure that out. So if you have a suggestion for...
Elite.
Well, it's because your name's Colin, so you make up at least the majority of that minus the S. You're the Colin, we're the S and the elite. You're Colin, we're the elite. So
I like that.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. But this is a blast. We hope to have more conversations like this as these disclosures develop. And a lot of you are really encouraged by this conversation. So all that being said, and again, if you want to help support content like this as we build and revamp, you can go to thecultishtshow.com. There is a donate tab. You can donate one-time or monthly, and you can also help contribute to future conversations like this. All right, everyone. Thanks for hanging out with us for the last 2 hours or so on here on Facebook. Ray, you got another meeting you got to get to, so thanks again for coming on. And
Thank
Colin, we'll be in touch soon.
Yep.
And awesome. We'll talk to you guys next time on Cultish. Talk to you guys soon.
Bye.
Blessings.